Now, I don't know if you know this, but we have started a Worldview History Channel project. We just released on Friday our first History Channel program where we went to the attempted assassination location when it comes to President Reagan there at the Washington Hilton. We want to get you a camera and get you out to these sites, and we need you filing regular reports telling us about the locations and the sites and getting footage so you can send it back to us on Dropbox, and then we can produce 30-minute, 15-minute specials, an hour with voiceover on historical sites in Israel. You want to do that?
Brandon, I can start to do that today, tomorrow. I've got.
I knew you could.
I can do that, and
All right.
I can travel around, and we can start to do that. And if
let's
you
do
want
it.
me to,
all right, let's talk to Logan and get this going.
Great, sounds great.
Yep, let's get it going, folks. There you go. That'd be great. All right, thanks for listening, folks. Talk to you tonight on Worldview Report and Brandon House Live. Take care.
YouTube, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brandon House.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Opening the new front against the previous Biden administration, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has announced a review of the 2021 U.S. Afghanistan withdrawal, calling the troop pullout disastrous and embarrassing. Hegseth vowed accountability for the events that led to the death of 13 U.S. service members. In a memo, Hegseth said that they have an obligation to the American people and to the war fighters who fought in Afghanistan to get to the bottom of it and get the truth. In addition to the deaths of 13 U.S. troops, 170 civilians lost their lives in the chaotic military pullout operation at Kabul International Airport. Sharing his memorandum on social media on the platform X, Hegseth announced the panel will be led by Sean Parnell, the Pentagon's assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. Sean Parnell served in Afghanistan for 16 months in 2006 and 2007 as a platoon leader in Paktika province near Pakistan's border. He was court-martialed as a Marine Lieutenant General and left the service in 2021 after posting videos that criticized senior officials over the troop withdrawal. Parnell will be joined in the review by former Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller, who had pleaded guilty in the Biden administration in 2021 for failure of duty, contempt towards official, and willfully disobeying a superior officer. This after he lambasted senior military officials about that faulty withdrawal.
I want to say this very strongly. I have been fighting for 17 years. I am willing to throw it all away to say to my senior leaders, I demand accountability.
Accountability. Will we get it with the Secretary of Defense review of the Afghanistan debacle? Welcome to Training Tuesday. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube, our X Spaces simulcast. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Scheller was right, in my opinion, and I'm glad he's on the team that the Secretary of Defense has established to conduct this review. We all dedicated years, in my case, the last decade of my 32-year career to defeating the enemy in Afghanistan. Sadly, we did defeat the enemy, but transitioned to a nation-building mission that led directly to the epic failure we saw culminate under the Biden administration. The blood of Americans was spilled unnecessarily, and hundreds of civilians died because of the decisions made in the years and months leading up to their deaths. However, no senior officer or civilian decision makers have been held accountable for the tragedy. In fact, today, you'll learn that some have even been promoted to 4-star level and handed command of critically important organizations. I think it's more than appropriate we talk about this review effort today, the day after Memorial Day, the day in which we honor those Americans who've fallen in service to our country. That is why my guest today is senior geopolitical strategist, drone expert, author, and most importantly, retired Lieutenant Colonel, Army helicopter pilot, Darren Gobb. Lieutenant Colonel Dobb spent 4 years of his service in Afghanistan and at one point wrote a plan to evacuate the country in the event of an emergency. Darren, welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's been too long.
Hey, Rob, always a pleasure to join you. Yes, it has been too long, that's for sure. But that's not my fault.
Oh, no, it's my fault because I'm a terrible scheduler. I never was any good at that. Just ask my old bosses for the Air Force.
Of course.
Well, hey, man, you know, I mentioned that you wrote an evacuation plan as part of what you were doing in one of your many tours in Afghanistan. What do you think about the review panel? And are you glad that Hegseth is doing this? Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I'm glad he's doing it. Granted, I'm going to have to hold out hope that it ends up with some sort of result that matters. That's always seems to be the question: is are we going to analyze this thing to death and then nothing ever happens? That seems to be sort of like the DC way of doing business. But ideally, it will expose some things that maybe the general public didn't know, and hold some people accountable. And when I mean accountability, I mean it's sometimes also maybe recognizing that someone did something heroic that hasn't been put out there in public yet that should be, and that people should know about, and they received their just rewards for those kinds of actions. But as we know, also, there are far more people that were involved in this that just seem to be okay with making some of the most strategic blunders any presidential administration could ever make in embarrassing our country on the national stage. I mean, yeah. I did 4 tours there, but I went back and forth many other times throughout the years for a variety of reasons. And it just seems like I never left the country. But unfortunately, that seems like another wasted investment at this point.
Yeah, and the length of the operation, especially after 2005, leading up to the withdrawal and everything, do you think that lends itself to working against getting to the bottom of things from an accountability perspective? Because, you know, this deal was a lot more than just about the last 6 months, wasn't it?
It was. There's a lot more that the review could take a look at, too. I mean, it's from a perspective on a guy on the ground who was there 04, 06, then back multiple times, even for short or short little stints, and then 2011 and 12, 13, all those windows. You get to see it each time, and it's always changing. But what never changed was it's winter, things are calming down. Oh, spring is coming, fighting season's coming. Through the summer, you're in the middle of fighting season. Then, oh, that's winter. And guess what? You just kind of recycle 20 times. And it's kind of reminds me of my time in Korea. The standard joke was, we've been in Korea 1 year 50 times, or whatever. At the time, of course, it was 98, 99. So that's kind of what Afghanistan turned into, with, of course, a very brutal and embarrassing end.
Yeah, when I left, my last combat tour was mid 2005. Our out brief with the boss was, hey, when we got here, we asked for the strategy from the Air Operations Center, and the answer we got was go to your kill box, do your vol time, your vulnerability time, the time you're in the box, and respond when troops are in contact and request it. That was it.
That's it.
So we told him, look, sir, I mean, we've defeated the enemy to the extent that we intended to at the beginning. Maybe it's time to start, getting the heck out of here and handing this country back over to their people. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So there's a whole lot of decisions from that time frame, just past that time frame, up until the withdrawal that really need to be looked at, regardless of the administration that was in power, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it's from the farcical to the ridiculous to the heroic. I mean, it's all there, of course, but trying to think that we could go in there and enforce a Western style democracy on a land like that, whose entire history is one of saying we don't want outsiders interjecting themselves here and you can leave and we'll fight you until the bitter end, however many years it takes. Well, I mean, we went into valleys in Afghanistan where they thought we were the Russians still. That's how isolated some of those areas are. And it's just, you just get tired of it. And he used the word strategy, which of course there never really was one. And I tried to define it too for most of Eastern Afghanistan for a while for people. And it was just like, you know, train them, let them fight for themselves. It's like, okay, yeah, that sounds easier than it really is. And you're trying to enforce things like the farcical type of stuff, trying to say, okay, Afghanistan, here's your digital logistics systems for ordering parts for your Humvees and your Toyotas. Oh, you can't read. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Through no fault of their own, whatever. It's like they have ways of doing business that works for them. Sometimes it's best to let them do that. And our job, as you said in the beginning, we accomplished it. We defeated an enemy. We punished a specific set of group and people who took part in the 9/11. Once you did that, I mean, it was time to go. But we drug it out until we caught Osama bin Laden, which, you know, I dare say we've known where he was for quite a long time. And then we kept dragging it out. And, you know, if this was the stock market, what's your return on investment in Afghanistan? It's not good.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you mentioned the training aspect of that latter mission, which I'll be honest, I wasn't involved in at all, except for to train my folks when I was a vice wing and wing commander to go over there and execute and everything. Were you surprised at the rapidity of the fall of the Afghan National Army in all of this?
Not a bit. And I think anybody who was up close and personal with this would have told anybody who was listening the same thing, that they're going to take back over and it's going to happen quickly. And it doesn't matter, you know, whether it's Trump, Biden, Obama, that part's basically irrelevant. They were postured for that for many years and able to do it. The question is, how do we withdraw? What message do we send and what priorities do we set out there as we're doing it? You know, I was part of a small team that set up the Security Force Assistance Brigades as they moved into Afghanistan, where you basically just gut the leadership of a light infantry brigade, for example, and bring them over with a small team and leave most of the brigade back in the United States under a skeleton crew of leadership. That did harm to the military in general. It didn't really help the Afghan army, Afghan police overcome exactly, you know, what we saw the result would be. And so there's a lot of different prices that got paid, the cost to this mission in ways that, you know, the Abbey Gate and our withdrawal from Afghanistan was just one small example of. And we knew years ago that this was not going to be one of those cases where we left and a budding democracy took place. And next thing you know, you've got a large size Switzerland in the middle of Central Asia. That just wasn't going to happen. China knew it too, by the way, because I saw them there in 2005. Their strategy was to creep into Afghanistan, knowing that someday we would leave and they would take over.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what you just described sounds eerily familiar to Vietnam. Creating indigenous units, but giving them American leadership, commander in the leadership team. That's those were some hard, bloody lessons learned from Vietnam that I thought that we had as an officer that rose up through the ranks post Vietnam. I thought we had overcome those.
Well, I would agree that it's definitely a lesson, but clearly we didn't learn them.
Yeah.
I would hope we did this time. We're very good about fighting the last battle, or the last war, not necessarily applying the things we need to from those wars. And I think we're doing the same thing now in some regards by acting like this, the drone warfares of today is a shock.
Right.
If you listen to the experts, you'd have been 15, 20 years ahead of this already. Instead, you're listening to DC think tanks and people who have nothing to do other than to try to find something they want to sell to the taxpayers at an exorbitant cost that's going to be ineffective for the next conflict, because it's trying to solve the last one. And Afghanistan is just one part of that.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow, Darren. Got to take our first break. When we come back, we'll see a little clip talking about the length of the operation and which decisions should be looked at. And we'll be right back with retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb, and helicopter pilot. And he's got more time in Afghanistan than anybody I personally know. So it's a very interesting conversation. It's one that has to be had, especially today, the day after Memorial Day. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they have access to all your data? Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, well, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldviewtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
The new review will add to the many completed investigations on the matter. Last year, you may remember that Republican lawmakers, led by Representative Michael McCaul, wrapped up a 2-year review that accused former President Joe Biden's administration of lying to the American people and sacrificing the safety of U.S. soldiers during the Afghanistan pullout. One of these investigators responsible for the McCaul probe findings, a journalist and author, Jerry Dunleavy, will also join Sean Parnell's new investigation team. Hegseth largely blamed the Biden administration for the poorly execution of the end to the war. He also seemed to suggest, like Colonel Scheller, that uninformed military leaders should have resigned in protest rather than carry out the flawed withdrawal plan. But experts say that the review of the Afghanistan withdrawal might not look into some important decisions that took place before. First, the deal President Trump made with the Taliban back in 2020, which set a deadline for the U.S. to leave Afghanistan. Second, why the Afghan military collapsed so quickly, even after receiving billions of dollars in support from the United States. Overall, this means some important questions might not get answered. For all the latest news, download the WeOn app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Training Tuesday, and the discussion today is about the new review panel that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has established under Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs Sean Parnell, who is himself a platoon commander, platoon leader with, I think, about 16 or 17 months of combat time in Afghanistan. And my guest today is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb, who's a helicopter pilot, but also, and probably even most importantly, has spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, over 4 years, plus trips back and forth, and helped write one of the emergency evacuation plans. And Darren, that clip, I wanted to point that out, that the agreement that the first Trump administration had with the Taliban should be looked at too, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it's consistent to say that we don't want to do the deep dive into Afghanistan only because of Biden or only because of Obama or anything. This should be one of those things where you crack the whole thing wide open and you have the right people who can look at everything that happened. Because they're going to compare what's the difference between what Trump was working and what Biden ended up executing. And was there inherent failures we should have expected out of Trump's plan that we just never got to realize? Or what would have made it a whole lot better than what Biden ended up doing? I can suppose certain things based on actions and a little bit of insider baseball, of course. What the plan was, I knew a little bit about it. But let's bring it together. Let's compare and contrast the differences. Because one thing's for sure, those who were defending Biden religiously and everything that happened were constantly pointing back to the fact that Trump planned on leaving too, and they think that just by stating that the two things are equal. Well, there may be areas where they were equal, but there clearly were areas where they were not as well, and it certainly showed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of finger pointing backwards at the Trump administration for that May 1st date, which really, I guess the Taliban, the way things go with agreements like that is if one side breaks it, the other side feels free to do what they think they need to do in their best interest. The Taliban obviously were intent on taking over the country. No surprise to me. Haven't seen this before, but that's all the more reason to go back all the way back to the decision to get into nation building, isn't it?
Well, it is. That's the key word. I was going to bring it up if you didn't. It's George Bush said we're not going to be involved in nation building, and then we turned into nation builders. It seems like we have a hard time defining and establishing those conditions that say this is when we leave. They're never going to be perfect. So you have to establish what conditions you're content with in accomplishing the mission and then leaving. And we would have been there probably 20% of the time or less than the time that we were actually there. People who do not want to own their nation and build it into something that we envision for them are simply not going to do that. And Taliban took over very quickly because, well, they're the ones who are going to stay there, and they knew full well we were leaving. I would disagree with the idea that we set a date on something like happened even under the Trump administration. You focus on conditions and say, when these conditions are met, we will leave. I love what he did regarding, the Taliban leader and saying, hey, listen, here's a picture of your house. You touch one of our soldiers, we'll kill all of you, that kind of thing. That's a message Afghanistan understands. But the Taliban was poised to take over regardless of whether it was when it happened or whether it was years earlier, regardless of the presidency. That was always going to happen. It's just a question of whether or not we displayed an international sign of weakness and incompetence in the way that we did it, or maybe not. But unfortunately, that message was heard around the world, and we see the consequences still today.
Well, you're absolutely right. You mentioned, I'm glad you brought it up, that we should be making decisions and those kind of agreements, and whether we go through a what I call a gate, because you set up a series of gates to get to success, which in this case would have been our peaceful withdrawal. And when you do that, you do it by conditions base. You don't do it by time. And I thought I heard President Trump say that several times publicly. That the withdrawal and the agreement would be conditions based. Was I incorrect about that?
Well, he did, absolutely. And I think that part was pretty clear, but there was also a date put out there that, whether it's real or not, it was still something that's out there. And then they needed to continue to make sure that it was emphasized that we're going to leave based on these series of conditions. That I think that was fairly clear. At least for those of us who paid attention to things regularly. One might ask, do the man on the street type interview with people running around New York City or LA or wherever, and ask them, hey, did you hear this? See which one of the two they remember and why. But you can also put a date on it and say, we'll leave by this date if these certain conditions are met. That's not necessarily inconsistent. I think we've both seen versions of that in the past. But when we up and evacuated Bagram basically overnight and didn't tell anybody, well, there's your first condition, and it was the one that went the opposite direction of where it needed.
Yeah, that resulted in what? Somewhere around 5,000 prisoners of war being released from a prison camp that wasn't far from Bagram, if I remember correctly. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, and the prison facility was right in the middle of Bagram. I'm very familiar with it, having moved plenty of people to take up residence there in my own way. But and frankly, like I tell people quite often, once you gave up Bagram, the plan I wrote is out the window. It's basically mostly useless.
Yeah, you beat me to my
Predicated
next
on that
question.
location.
What hallmarks of your plan did you see or did you not see? We just got one there, the Bagram Air Base being released. That doesn't sound like it was part of your plan.
No, and it was probably one of the most critical. Besides the strategic messaging part and the kind of, I guess, rules of engagement restrictions that the people were put under when they got there, the Marines and in the 82nd Airborne. And it seems like they kept their hands tied. Still, the way counterinsurgency fights seem to devolve into the strategic corporal thing, where you can't really do anything because it might look bad on camera. But I guess what I found that people really wanted to know about the most was what's the difference between Bagram to the north and Kabul, which was 15-minute flight maximum for a Black Hawk from Bagram to Kabul. Why such a difference? And the description's kind of easy in some ways. Saying, would you rather do not an exercise, but an actual evacuation like that under fire out of a place like LaGuardia in New York? Or would you rather have a walled-in airbase in the middle of nowhere, easily secured, to do that? The answer there is obvious, but when you expand that even more, Kabul, dual-use airport, civilian and military, dual-use security, lots of different access points if used or exploited correctly, high-rise apartment buildings surrounding the airfield that can easily be exploited from targeting standpoint to photos, and you name it, it's all there, very visible. Most densely populated area, very, very little of it under any kind of control. Bagram, all of that, the opposite. So,
yeah,
if you put Bagram out, you change the plan significantly. How many forces you're bringing in, what security is needed, how you stage people, how you move people to that location. I mean, this is a book by itself, just the change of that airfield.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't make any sense to me that you would move from Bagram Air Base, which started out as a Soviet air base, so it was out in the middle of nowhere, and like you said, easily secured, not surrounded by population centers, and you put yourself right in the middle of Kabul with millions of people surrounding you, of which you've proven to yourself time and time again you can't even vet the troops from the Afghan population that have done green on blue assassinations and hits and killed even a 2-star Army general, American Army general at one point. And you put yourself in that position. It's incredible. Well, we got a question from the audience. Let's go ahead and take that. Rob, the Patriot, is my host over there. Go ahead, Rob.
All right, Colonel, we have Colonel Burton.
Hey, Colonel Gobb, I want to ask you, the President Trump had spoken about keeping a strategic presence there. Obviously, Iran, Pakistan, centrally located there. Was it, and I don't know if you can even talk about it, but was it truly part of the plan to keep a strategic presence there? And we know of lots of other airfields that we had built up, Dwyer, Leatherneck, Kandahar. Was that part of the plan if President Trump had been in office and this was going to go forward as he was, he said he was getting out of Afghanistan? Was the plan at any point that you know of to actually keep a hard strategic presence, but, like you said, well away from the population areas? Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. And there were, as always, there are multiple plans that go into these things. And so you leave yourself options. You never make plan A and then don't do anything else because you never know what's going to happen. But yes, there were reasons why Bagram would be kept. and why it could have been kept in the right situation, which is why it's also, by the way, popped up again recently as a base that we considered reoccupying under the right circumstances. And you mentioned with a couple of the countries why, but I guess that's about as far as you can really go with that. But that did not go unnoticed that it was part of the plan, or one of the plans.
Yeah, one of the plans. And you would assume that if the president's talking about it, that he had a pretty good concept that he had in mind and was flowing resources to do that. It makes you wonder what part of the plan didn't get followed by the Biden administration and why. And I think that's also a key piece to this. But another key piece, Darren, and we'll get to it after the break, is there's a long, dark shadow of unaccountable leadership in the United States military over our population. And I think it's hurt recruiting, which is starting to come back now because of the transparency and the aggressive leadership of the Trump administration. But we've got to talk about those leaders that not only survived these huge errors in judgment, but got promoted. And we'll be right back with Darren Gobb, my guest today on Training Tuesday, talking about the review of the Afghanistan debacle.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans. The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th, this afternoon, at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time, and the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan. The military phase of this operation is ended. The diplomatic sequel to that will now begin.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Training Tuesday. We're discussing Secretary Hegseth's review panel he's established to review the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And my guest today is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb. Darren, when I see that clip in the beginning of it, you couldn't hear her speaking, but it showed a night vision goggle view of was titled "The Last Soldier Leaves Afghanistan." And you're very familiar with that photograph. It shows the general, I think, was in charge of the 82nd Airborne and the entire task force operation at Kabul Airport, walking up the ramp of his aircraft. And but it just reminds me, and the whole clip there, even from General McKenzie, just reminds me of the lies, the incessant lies that I watch senior leaders of the United States Armed Forces tell Congress and the president and the public year after year after year. We're winning. We're winning. We're winning. Oh, this is the last guy to leave Afghanistan right here. We're off to a diplomatic sequel now, and there it just. I think that's worth discussing, and it has to be covered in this review.
It does, and I'll give you an interesting background here. Is when I was in Fort Riley, Kansas, I was Secretary of the General Staff working for the Division Commander, General Funk. And he had two brand new one-star generals come walking through and taking over their positions as we got ready for more missions in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And one of those was General Donahue in that picture. And the other one was, at the time he was the division commander, his boss, General Eric Kurilla. So both of them come basically walking into Fort Riley at the same time together. Kurilla went off to command the 82nd Airborne Division, and then to command the 18th Airborne Corps. Donahue went off to replace Kurilla, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division. And so when Donahue went over to Afghanistan with this particular mission, his boss at the 18th Airborne Corps was Kurilla, and of course Mackenzie was the CENTCOM boss over in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So I know two of these guys quite personally, worked around them quite a bit, but a lot of other people did too, and many of them are still disappointed to this day. And the hard part is hearing and seeing what happened, knowing that Donahue got on that airplane, took that picture 3 times to get it right, borrowed some of the gear in order to make it right, and then as soon as he got on the plane and sat down, of course, the loadmaster on the C-17 hops off, does his checks, and hops on. And I mean, if you so by the letter of the law, if you really wanted to just make it simple, that was the last person in Afghanistan, the last boots on the ground, was an Air Force crewman. Neither one of them have been accountable yet. Guess, of course, I'm sure we're going to get to this, but guess where those two officers are now?
That's what I was going to ask you. Where are those two gentlemen now, Kurilla and Donahue?
Yeah, and even Mackenzie, I'll add in Mackenzie, retired without effect and living his life. Both of those other two have made their 4 stars. Kurilla is commanding Central Command, is overseeing, frankly, what's happening right now in the Middle East and Israel. And although his position was held up for a while, Donahue's over as a 4-star in Europe. So, some of us uphold our oaths, sacrifice greatly, and end our careers early because we did it. Some people adhere to whatever the agenda is and just follow whatever orders are given blindly, and promotions are your result.
Yeah, what does that say about where we want to see some results from this review from that perspective? What do you want to see from it that's actionable about the leadership and accountability?
Well, I think there's 2 sides of this, but when it comes to the uniform side that I'll focus on, if the initial results warrant it, there's nothing wrong with setting up a courts martial and saying, hey, we're going to put these people, whoever these people are, before a court-martial commuting authority and put them through that process. Now, what a lot of people don't understand who haven't worn the uniform before is that a court-martial can be everything from complete exoneration up to jail time. I mean, all points in between. It doesn't assume guilt. It doesn't assume anything, which part of the reason why I can't be on that panel, or at least any kind of courts-martial jury, because, well, I think my opinion's already been well known. But you can do something like that, and maybe, a 4-star general whose last honorable rank served was as a 1-star or as a full colonel, whatever that may be. They can be demoted to that rank and then retired. Or it can be more extreme, or it can be virtually nothing if the situation warrants it and there's not enough proof, or whatever that situation may be. I think that would be actionable. And then there's the civilian side of things for those who may have been involved, and they have their own way of doing that. And frankly, I lay the whole thing regardless in Biden's lap. He owns the whole thing, no matter how much he runs.
Well, yeah, he was the commander in chief, and I guess there has been some accountability to the voters. The American people have held him accountable. his party lost its reelection to the position. I'm not gonna go into this show whether he was really president or not because of his mental capacity. But we all know that decisions were being made by a group of people unnamed, and I think those folks need to be found out and held accountable and their roles identified. Really, don't you?
I agree. I'm going to name drop. I'll just use the name Susan Rice, and we can go from there. But that's one of the people. You've got all these people hiding out in dark and shady places at the White House, Department of Defense, and elsewhere, who are constantly on the negative side of anything that happens for the United States and the countries we're trying to work in. I guess another name I would throw out there might be, where is Victoria Nuland in all this? Kind of like the ghost of everything that has failed in Ukraine. Her fingerprints seem to be in all the bad places. So I think there's plenty to peel back, and it's going to take some time. My concern turns into, if nothing happens and business just kind of goes on as usual, you're going to see a lot of trust lost in the veteran community. Those Gold Star families, all these people who are expecting more out of this. I have no idea whether that's going to be a reality or if we're going to see some real accountability here, which I think we all really badly want. If you see that, that's awesome. But if you don't, it's almost too late to fix it.
Yeah, I was pleased to see that Stu Scheller, who's serving, I think his official position is a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, but he's going to be on this review panel. And I haven't had a chance to talk to him at all about it, but I hope to someday to see how he felt about getting the assignment. But one of my concerns is, though, you've seen what's happening with Dan Bongino as deputy director of the FBI. I think he's being used kind of as a foil to give the bureaucrats cover for not having things like the evidence about the Epstein client list out for public view at this point. Any concerns in that regard?
I'm always concerned about that kind of stuff. I mean, I hear like Pam Bondi talking about how we got to review these and there's 10,000 victims and it's going to take a while. And okay, that may be true, but the trust of the American people right now is rock bottom with any kind of federal bureaucracy and anybody who seems to be putting more effort into doing television interviews than exposing the underside of everything that's happening. You don't have to do the entire Epstein client list. You don't have to expose all of it at one time. You can clear enough and say, okay, here's a name and here's the proof. Here's everything that you're looking for. This is one example of hundreds. There'll be more. But I'm always concerned when these things just drag on and drag on, drag on. The American people gave the GOP the trifecta, House, Senate, and the presidency. And if that may never happen again, if at the end of it, we're still right back where we started. That never works.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the report from Congress that the initial clip in the show talked about, or the second clip in the show talked about, but that was a 2-year investigation. And I don't see that anybody was held accountable for the Afghanistan withdrawal based on that. And if the DOD panel is going to use that, and it's my understanding one of the investigators from that committee investigation is on the review panel, then do you have very high expectations for any actionable outcomes like we were talking about with the generals?
Unfortunately, I keep my expectations very low when it comes to this stuff anymore. It just seems like people lack the willpower to do something that needs to be done. And the general officer rank thing doesn't scare me one bit. If you do right, then great. We should magnify that. If you do extremely wrong, then we should magnify that too and make sure that those people are held accountable regardless of how you get there. But yeah, if all we're going to see is here's another investigation 3 years down the road, yep, nothing happened. Well, There's a reason why everything basically that's Washington, D.C. is at the bottom of every approval rating across this nation. And it should stay there if they fail to realize what we want them to do here.
Yeah, we've got a midterm congressional election looming already. That's why the founders created the 2-year election cycle, in my opinion, was to try to get people to show some backbone and do what's right for the country before you get to the point where you're losing the House of Congress. And we gave them the trifecta, as you mentioned. But doesn't look like there's a lot of hope out there on the base voter side, on the side of the American people that voted for all this. A lot of skepticism. Well, I want to, in the next segment, in the last segment, I wanted to show, and we will show, the Abbey Gate 13 and talk about that and find out what you know about how they came to be in that situation. You've kind of mentioned the rules of engagement already, but I want to see if we can get specific and talk about what needs to be held accountable for that specific action itself and the death of those 13 Americans. We'll be right back with my guest, Darren Gobb. We're talking about accountability and the Afghanistan withdrawal and the new opportunity here with SecDef Hegseth's review panel. We'll be right back.
Afghanistan.
Yes.
Were you the last person in the room?
Yes.
And you feel comfortable?
I do.
Dozens were killed when multiple bombs went off near Kabul's Hamid Karzai airport Thursday.
We know that at least 13 U.S. service members were killed in the blast.
He claimed that on his watch, we have not lost any American troops. The lives of no American troops have been lost as long as he's been president. Obviously, that is not true. Apparently, he's already forgotten about the 13 American heroes who were lost with his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. These are their names, Mr. President. These are their names. Marine Staff Sergeant Taylor Hoover. Marine Sergeant Johanny Rosario Pichardo. Marine Sergeant Nicole G. Marine Corporal Hunter Lopez. Marine Corporal Dagan Page. Marine Corporal Humberto Sanchez. Marine Lance Corporal David Espinoza. Marine Lance Corporal Jared Schmitz. Marine Lance Corporal Riley McCollum. Marine Lance Corporal Dylan Marola. Marine Lance Corporal Kareem Nakui. Navy Petty Officer 3rd Class Maxton Soviak. Army Staff Sergeant Ryan Knaus. We will honor their memory.
We will honor their memory and we will say their names at every opportunity on this day after Memorial Day 2025, not because we have to, but because our country depends on that honoring of every warrior that's lost and fallen in combat. Every one of them. That's why we do that day. Those Americans, their sacrifice is what creates the America of tomorrow for my grandchildren and your grandchildren. So we'll always do that. And when something unique happens that causes the deaths of Americans in uniform unnecessarily because of poor decision making and planning, we should make sure that we talk about it incessantly until there is accountability. And that's why my guest today is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb, who's also was a Black Hawk helicopter pilot in the Army, a planner, a graduate, I believe, of the highest graduate school that an Army soldier officer can achieve, the SAMS class. And Darren, I couldn't let this day go by without showing their names and talking about that and talking about this part of this operation, because those of us that understand rules of engagement and have fought in these types of situations could see it even in the public media broadcasting clips that were being shown. We could see that there were some decisions being made that put these kids at risk, couldn't we?
Yeah, and I guess it's a victim of the continuing process of nation building and counterinsurgency fighting, that over time you become less and less willing to accept any kind of risk, either on your own people, or you accept more risk more on your own people than you do on the population of the country that you're in. And that just manifested itself in this case quite publicly, and it was horrible, because as we heard in testimony, that they had eyes on the person who they were fairly certain was the bomber. And even if the person wasn't, what you have to look at is, who gave the commands, who gave the orders, both from the restricted rules of engagement down to actual radio calls on site at the time. And my friend Michael Yon, who you may have heard of, one of those guys who was there, can talk about the details in very specific detail, all the way down to individual people at the gate, because he was there. And my perspective, watching it from this end, of course, was that rules of engagement did not allow for these soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to succeed in that situation, because everybody was concerned about how restrictive they were. That's not a judgment, by the way, on those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at all. They wanted to go there to succeed. They wanted to get the mission done, get it done right, and get home. And they would have done whatever was necessary to do so. They assumed a lot of risk regardless, because of where they were, and they just answered the call of their nation, where the politicians sent them. There's plenty to learn from it. But this is why this review needs to be more than just the last few years. It needs to go back a while. How did we grow into a military in Afghanistan where we essentially just tied our own hands and feet and asked, why aren't we running?
Yeah. It's, I go back to the lies. And even after this, when we killed a man and several members of his family, and we lied about it and said that he was the bomber or the planner. I forget exactly what they called him, but he was the key figure in this bombing. It turns out he was actually working for a nonprofit that was helping us.
Yeah. Remember that diplomacy that was taking over there at the beginning when you showed General McKenzie's video?
Yeah,
that diplomacy is apparently just lots of cash getting sent to the Taliban in hopes that they've suddenly turned into a peaceful group of people who are trying to do something for the good of their people, for the good of their nation and the people who live there. Clearly not.
Yeah.
They should never have expected that. And by the way, on top of that, let's just go ahead and leave you all kinds of small arms, vehicles, helicopters, billions of dollars worth of equipment, and just make sure that this failure is as large and as public as possible. And we've seen the consequence in the wars that are still ongoing today.
Would you say that they're probably the best armed third world nation in the world now from an armaments perspective?
Certainly seems like it. I mean, I'm not going to say that their maintenance standards are very high, but I think the easy way to describe it is we went into Afghanistan to crush the Taliban, established a counterinsurgency to remove all these militants, and we left 20 years later with both of them being stronger than when we showed up.
Yeah, yeah, and able to have an impact on their neighbors, Iran and Pakistan, right?
They already are. Iran and Afghanistan are having wars over water access. Pakistan has become less of a friend to Afghanistan as they exchange militant bases and firing things back and forth. Afghanistan's become a better armed version of what it was before.
Yeah, exactly.
We're part of it now.
As we go forward with this review, uh, I haven't seen all of the members that have been appointed yet. I don't know if you have or not. What do you think is the optimal size of this team, and what other players besides Mr. Scheller, Mr. Parnell, and this individual, I can't remember his name. I saw it very briefly. Came on as was the investigator in the congressional committee. What would your thoughts be on what the rest of this team should look?
Well, I think that's a decent start regarding the rank structure, because the first thing that some of these general officers are going to do would be to circle the wagons around themselves. There may be some today that have made that rank who at the time were not, that are brought in. But to me personally, I think the highest rank on the whole thing should be an 06 colonel or captain Navy level. And the team probably needs to be about 10 at the most. And then they just go out and do interviews and things like that. Smaller teams are faster, more nimble, more effective. But it can't just be a Department of Defense either. You've got to bring in Department of State, who, by the way, they were centrally focused on Kabul. So you wonder why everything was run out of Kabul.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to remember, that Department of State was really kind of like the head honcho in a lot of this, as opposed to the Department of Defense. So you got to have some state functions, and there's some other little functions that will fill in there. But I think the message of putting Scheller in charge is the message that needs to be heard, just like they turned Matt Lohmeyer into Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, or Vice Secretary of the Army, excuse me. And,
Air Force. We got Matt as the Undersecretary of the Air Force.
He's probably going to call me later and say, "What are you talking about?"
But he would have called me if I hadn't corrected you.
I'm the Army guy and I'm a pilot. What can I say? It's all confusing. But I think it needs to be small. Definitely got to get state in there, but you got to keep them nimble and adaptive and able to move. But you don't want to make this look like another one of those circus charades where you just bring in a whole bunch of high-ranking individuals whose goal will ultimately be to cover for the government rather than expose the truth.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you think that those ranks you mentioned should be civilians? I'm not so sure. I think there should be any active duty officers on this. I like the fact that Parnell was a platoon leader. It has combat experience. Scheller obviously does. He was a lieutenant colonel, I think. But the core of officers that we've grown the last 4 to 6 years has been really tainted with things like DEI, wokeism, CRT. You name all the initials of Marxism, indoctrination that we've seen there. I'm not so sure that we should have anybody in uniform on this.
Yeah. No, I don't want anybody in uniform. I want people who may have at one time worn it, but not wearing it now. I've told people if I was called, I would join it because I have a lot of information, a lot of expertise in the area. But you don't want to bring anybody.
I think you should be on it. I'm glad you brought that up. I think you should be on it. I almost didn't say it. I definitely think you should be on it with your experience in the planning and all the experience you have in the country. And what about the intelligence? Before we get to the end of the show, the intel side of this. Should that be represented? Should Gabbard or DNI Gabbard appoint somebody or a couple of people to come in and be on this team?
Yeah. And I was thinking, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe defense intelligence, not uniformed NSA. Somewhere in there is the right person to sit on there and say, okay, this is the picture that we painted for them, from what's the Taliban going to do down to the exact threat on Kabul at the time. All of that needs to be known and brought out from multiple different sources. But this needs to be completely a civilian effort, sort of like the Inspector General type of thing, where an organization that's not accountable to anybody else but maybe one person in the truth, rather than have people there who risk, future promotions because they dare to say what actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, we need people that have no concern about being promoted or continuing in uniform or even continuing in the civilian world, but have the right experience to be able to look at this with a cold, objective eye. It's one of those things, kind of like being on the jury. Like you, I would be conflicted out of any jury on a court martial for these, but I think it's the right place to have people that are involved in the combat operations, the planning, and the training of the troops to send them over there. I can't get it off my mind that even as a colonel, after I had not been in combat for 7 years, when I retired, I was still pinning bronze stars on my EOD team that I was sending over, and my cops that I was sending over during 2011 before I left the Air Force. Yeah. Well, Darren, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. I appreciate you helping me honor the Abbey Gate 13 again, and we can assure their parents that we're not going to let any stone go unturned, no matter whether anybody's a formal part of an investigation or not, my friend.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and I would add that I think we definitely need a former non-commissioned officer on this panel as well, because nobody can make some things straight like the sergeants of the world. So happy to be on the show, and thanks for having me on, and hopefully we can continue this discussion and see some results when this is
absolutely
done.
Absolutely. I got to get you back on to talk about your paper you wrote, your thesis you wrote about drones, because there's a lot to talk about that and artificial intelligence. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Darren Gobb. Tomorrow is Whistleblower Wednesday. We'll have a surprise guest for you then.
You're watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.